Welcome back, family. Today we want to shed some more light on the horrific conditions of enslaved pregnant women during the slave breeding era. You might have heard that the children of enslaved women were taken away from them almost immediately after birth. But most of us do not know the horrifying stories of these women during pregnancy and childbirth. Imagine a pregnant black woman who worked on a large plantation along with other enslaved people, and she's probably carrying her very first pregnancy. You would think her masters would excuse her until she delivered her baby and was healthy enough to resume work. The realities, instead, were that pregnant enslaved women were subjected to the same arduous labor and dealt the same harsh treatment as any other slave on the plantation. In fact, they were made to return to work in a matter of days, and that's if she survives childbirth. They had no medical care at all. Enslaved pregnant women in those days were only at the mercy of other experienced enslaved women on slave breeding farms or plantations. In many cases, the child is taken away from the mother soon after it is weaned and sold off to other plantation owners. The story gets even more horrific on slave breeding farms, where enslaved women were forced to have countless sexual relationships with different men against their own wishes to breed more slaves for their owners. This practice was rampant in the predominantly agro-driven southern US states in the late 18th century and into the 19th century. Slave breeding was a common practice of forcing enslaved black women to have children to increase their owner's wealth. It happened throughout the duration of the transatlantic slave trade in the United States. However, it intensified in the early 1800s, particularly after the end of the international slave trade in 1808. As a result, owners resorted to increasing their stock through forced breeding. The children born from this practice were often separated from their families and sold to other owners, further fueling the profitability of slavery. Slave breeding was further encouraged by laws that saw the objectification of slaves. They were seen as property rather than human beings and were treated as such. This inhumane practice continued until the end of the Civil War in 1865, when slavery was finally abolished in the United States. Enslaved black women were often brutally denied the basic right to care for their babies, leaving the women to suffer the severe emotional pain that follows after separation from their babies. Part of that experience was the heartbreaking fact that these women would never again set eyes on their children. Before we continue to unravel the tough realities of enslaved women during pregnancy and childbirth, understand that we are just scratching the surface with all of this information. Back in 1619, when the privateer, the White Lion, brought 20 enslaved Africans ashore in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia, slavery wasn't based on race. People were enslaved mostly because they were captured and sold off. But soon after that, as slavery continued to become profitable, some US states passed laws to ensure that slaves remain enslaved for life, passing them from one generation to another, or from one owner to another. They made sure that enslaved people had no rights. By the 1800s, slave breeding became the new method to perpetuate the slavery business, considering that the international slave trade had been abolished. Slave breeding farms were established on many plantations across America, particularly in the South. These slave breeding farms had only one purpose: to breed more slaves, and they employed every available tactic to make this happen. They selected enslaved black men who were perceived to have desirable physical traits and abilities to impregnate enslaved black women, and the children were separated and sold off soon after childbirth. One of these slave farms was owned by a very prominent and influential American statesman, Thomas Jefferson. Yes, it is the same Thomas Jefferson you know. Thomas Jefferson was an American founding father and the third president of the United States. He was one of the principal authors of the Declaration of Independence, which is considered to be one of the most important documents in American history. Jefferson's contributions to the United States extended beyond his presidency. However, Jefferson has also been criticized for his controversial views on slavery. The man owned a 5,000-acre working plantation and a slave farm, also known as Monticello in Virginia, where Jefferson kept over 600 enslaved black people to work for him. Many of the enslaved individuals who labored on his plantation were subjected to harsh working conditions and experienced substantial mistreatment. Jefferson bred many slaves on his farm and saw nothing wrong in doing so. In fact, the man famously had a long-term non-consensual sexual relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, with whom he had several children. Sally Hemings had at least 6 children fathered by Thomas Jefferson, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. But it will interest you to know that Jefferson's relationship with Hemmings was a product of the institution of slavery, which allowed white slaveholders to exploit and abuse the bodies of their enslaved black people. This meant that Sally's children were also Jefferson's slaves and were not recognized as his children. But decades after negotiations, Jefferson freed all of Sally Hemings' children. But it wasn't just Thomas Jefferson who perpetuated this practice. Many in America also did. They saw enslaved black women as breeding machines to be used as they deemed fit. Another American founding father who shared the same ideology as Jefferson was Pierce Meese Butler. Butler saw nothing wrong in using enslaved women as breeders. Many slaveholders would buy young and able farm men and well-developed young girls with fine physiques to barter and sell. William Ward, an enslaved black man in Georgia, who was interviewed by the WPA Slave Narrative Project in 1937, mentioned that they were raised and sold off like pigs on slave farms. In fact, young and pretty enslaved black women were often advertised for sale as good breeding stock. Throughout the history of slavery, several documents showed how slaveholders sexually exploited black people. Another notable example of this disturbing practice is the story of a woman named Mary Reynolds, who was enslaved on a tobacco plantation in Virginia in the early 1800s. Mary was born into slavery to the Kilpatrick family in Black River, Louisiana. When she was interviewed in 1937 by WPA Slave Narrative about her recollections of slavery, Mary narrated how many enslaved black women were forced to bear several children with men chosen by their owners, and each child was immediately taken away from their mother after birth. Physical and psychological abuse these women must have endured daily is difficult to fathom. Harriet Jacobs, who was enslaved in North Carolina, also wrote about her experience of being forced to have sexual relations with her owner and bear 2 children. Following maltreatment from her master's wife, Harriet ran away and hid in an attic in her grandmother's house for 7 years. There, she watched and nurtured her children as they grew. Her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, gives more insights into the anguish of being separated from her children, as well as the heart-wrenching situations of many pregnant enslaved women during her time. But the horrors didn't end there. Enslaved black women were subjected to horrific birthing practices and often denied any form of medical care during pregnancy. Some of these birthing practices exposed these women to infection and sometimes permanent injuries. In many cases, they were expected to deliver their babies in the fields or in their living quarters without any assistance from medical professionals. Many enslaved women were also subjected to medical experiments and were used as guinea pigs for doctors to practice their techniques on. This only added to the trauma of childbirth for enslaved women, leaving many of them with lifelong physical and emotional scars. It was only after the abolishment of slavery that birthing practices for black women began to improve. One notable procedure used on pregnant black slaves during childbirth was the breaking of the pelvis. Breaking of the pelvis during childbirth is a rare and complicated procedure that involves the expansion of the pelvic region during the delivery process. This is often used when the birth canal is too small or narrow and the baby cannot pass through, leading to complications. It is an excruciatingly painful procedure. No anesthesia was used on these women. Another barbaric childbirth system used on enslaved black women during this era was the birthing chair. The use of the birthing chair was one method of assisting labor and delivery and improving the chances of a safe birth for both mother and child. The birthing chair was designed to support and restrain the women in an upright position. This allowed gravity to assist in the childbirth process and minimize the discomfort of prolonged labor. Although there is very little documentation of this barbaric practice during the slave breeding era, Harriet Jacobs provided descriptions of the use of the birthing chair to restrain pregnant slaves during childbirth and the breaking of the pelvis procedure to facilitate childbirth. Perhaps the most graphic and heart-wrenching narrative of the barbaric childbirth practices used on enslaved black women during childbirth and pregnancy was the account of James Marion Sims. James Marion Sims was an American physician who was known as the father of modern gynecology. While his surgical techniques revolutionized the field of women's medicine, Sims' legacy is also highly controversial due to the unethical treatment of enslaved women that he used for his medical experiments. Considering that healthy enslaved black women were profitable as breeding stock for their white owners, they sometimes hired white doctors to assist the women in producing healthy offspring. One particular issue affecting many slave women at the time was vesicovaginal fistula. Vesicovaginal fistula is a condition that occurs when there is an abnormal opening between the bladder and the vagina. resulting in constant leakage of urine from the vagina. Vesicovaginal fistula caused severe physical discomfort, embarrassment, and social isolation for women who suffered from it. But slave women were especially vulnerable to developing this condition due to their poor living conditions, prolific childbearing, inadequate sanitary facilities, and lack of access to medical care. In most cases, the only treatment available was surgical repair, which was not always successful. The so-called father of modern gynecology, James Marion Sims, performed shocking experiments on enslaved black women in a bid to find a lasting surgical remedy. Critics say Sims cared more about his patients than about providing relief to his patients, and that he caused untold suffering by operating under the racist notion that black people did not feel pain. This is because Sims conducted his research only on enslaved black women without anesthesia. Two names among Sims' fistula patients stand out today from Sims' own records: Lucy and Anarcha. The account, as published by History.com, narrates the shocking experiences of these women. The first one he operated on was 18-year-old Lucy, who had given birth a few months prior and had been having severe trouble controlling her bladder since. During the procedure, Sims typically has his patients completely naked and perched on all fours. They were made to bend their knees and bend forward onto their elbows so their heads rested on their hands. Sims recounted that Lucy endured an hour-long surgery, screaming and crying out in pain, as nearly a dozen other doctors watched. Lucy's agony was extreme. She became extremely ill due to Sims' controversial use of a sponge to drain the urine away from the bladder, which led her to contract blood poisoning. He wrote, "I thought she was going to die. It took Lucy 2 or 3 months to recover entirely from the effects of the operation." For a long time, Sims' fistula surgeries were not successful. After 30 operations on another woman named Anarcha, a 17-year-old enslaved woman who had had a very traumatic labor and delivery, Sims finally perfected his method. After 4 years of experimentation on enslaved black women, later, he decided to use his newfound solution on white women, but with anesthesia, which was new to the medical field at the time. While some doctors didn't trust anesthesia at the time, Sims' decision not to use it or any other numbing technique on his experimental black bodies was solely based on his misguided belief that black people didn't experience pain as white people did. This is a misconception that persists today. According to a study conducted at the University of Virginia and published in the April 4th, 2016 proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But one thing was clear: Sims understood that race is a social construct and not a biological one. But he didn't stop at performing surgeries without using anesthesia on black women for years. He also invented a number of surgical tools during his experiments. People who defended his barbaric practices say the Southern-born doctor was simply a man of his time, for whom the end justified the means, and that enslaved women with fistulas were likely to have wanted the treatment badly enough that they would have agreed to take part in his experiments. Unfortunately, history didn't have the records of those women, as consent from their owners, who had a strong financial interest in their recovery, was the only legal requirement for conducting such procedures at the time. It is important to note that James Marion Sims wasn't the only one who practiced this method of reproductive medicine on enslaved women. Records show that there were other doctors who did similar things to enslaved women in the Caribbean and Brazil, where countless enslaved women were used to work on plantation, mines, and households. But in all of these, there was a high practice of midwifery and herbal medicine among enslaved women. Enslaved women who were experienced in childbirth and delivery often performed midwifery and herbal care on pregnant slaves. These women had knowledge and experience in traditional healing methods and were often utilized by slave owners to care for and tend to the health needs of other enslaved individuals, including their pregnant slaves. Midwifery was especially important as it ensured the continuation of the slave population and decreased the healthcare burden on slave owners. However, this work was often unpaid and undervalued, with enslaved women receiving little recognition or compensation for their hard work and expertise. Birthing a Slave by Marie Jenkins Schwartz is the first book to focus exclusively on the health care of enslaved black women, and it highlights the critical role of reproductive medicine in the slave system of antebellum America. In the author's words, black women, however, proved an unruly force, distrustful of both the slaveholders and their doctors, with their own healing traditions, emphasizing the power of roots and herbs and the critical roles of family and community. enslaved women struggled to take charge of their own health in a system that did not respect their social circumstances, customs, or values. Enslaved women who could give birth also didn't have a say in their babies' lives. The babies were taken and sold off within weeks. The children of enslaved women were not considered theirs, but the property of their white masters. Some were kept in a nursery with terrible sanitary conditions and were often forced to work from a very young age. They were subjected to the same treatment as other slaves on the plantation. They had no rights, no education, and no hope for a better life. One brutal example was the case of Horace Whitaker, a slave owner who sold off the children of his slaves to other slave owners as soon as they were weaned. Mothers would cry and watch helplessly as their children were taken away from them, never to be seen again. As for the children who endured such horror, perhaps we may never truly know what their experiences were like being born into slavery without experiencing any form of parenthood, enjoying their childhood, or having any sense of identity. The law even made sure this practice continued legally. The 1662 Virginia law stated that children of enslaved women were automatically born enslaved. This was done to clear up the confusion over what to do with the mixed-race children born as a result of sexual relations between a white master and an enslaved woman. This law remained in effect until the end of slavery on December 6, 1865 in the United States. Slave breeding was a truly dark era in the history of mankind. Slaveholders basically profited from the enslavement of African American children at birth. Educating ourselves and learning from historical mistakes can help shape a better and more equitable future for everyone. Thank you for sticking through to the end in this exploration of the untold horrors of enslaved women during pregnancy. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others. We aren't just telling stories, we're changing lives and waking the culture up. Click the video on the screen to learn some more hidden Black history they never taught you in school. We'll see you over there.